Before anything else, pause for a moment and breathe this in. Because what you're about to hear did not start with shouting. It didn't start with chaos. It started quietly, so quietly that almost no one noticed. And that's exactly why it mattered. Washington on that morning looked exactly the way it always does when it pretends everything is ordinary. Frost clung to the edges of the marble steps outside the Senate office buildings. Black SUVs rolled past without urgency. Staffers in dark coats moved briskly along long corridors, clutching folders, laptops, and coffee cups. Everything seemed predictable, calm, controlled. To most people, it was just another day in the nation's capital. A day in which history, if it happened at all, would pass unnoticed. But inside one of those imposing office buildings, the air felt different. The temperature didn't change, but something about the atmosphere hinted at tension. Not the kind of tension you hear or see, but the kind that presses quietly against your awareness, like the moment before a storm breaks. This was supposed to be a routine Senate confirmation hearing. That's how it had been described to the public, to the press, to everyone inside the room. A few polite questions. A few rehearsed answers. Perhaps a moment or two of mild tension. Then the vote. Routine. Expected. Predictable. Inside the committee room, the environment reinforced that sense of normalcy. The lighting was neutral, the kind designed to flatter faces on camera. Microphones and audio devices were perfectly placed. Cameras framed the proceedings just so, capturing the room from every standard angle. Reporters filled the gallery seats with professional detachment. Laptops were open. Phones rested at the ready. Pens hovered over notepads, expecting to record statements that likely would never stir public debate. Everything suggested that the hearing was under control, that nothing unexpected could or would occur, that no one would leave the room surprised, unsettled, or challenged. At the center of it all sat the nominee, composed, confident, comfortable. The posture alone communicated authority. Hands folded neatly on the table, shoulders back, head held high. Every small gesture calculated to show control, to convey competence. Every detail in the appearance was deliberate. The suit perfectly pressed, hair immaculately styled, a smile poised to convey calm assurance. Eyes alert but not anxious. This was not a person caught off guard. This was someone who had prepared for every question, anticipated every challenge, and rehearsed every possible answer. The prior sessions had gone smoothly. Compliments from members of both parties had been noted. Praise for experience, professionalism, and dedication had been offered. Even the critical questions had landed softly, answered with precision and polish. From the outside, it seemed the hearing had already been won. Senators leaned back slightly in their chairs, glancing through notes with practiced ease. Some checked the time. A few exchanged subtle nods or quiet jokes, reminders that the day's business was familiar, routine. The clerk called the session to order in a calm, even voice. Nothing seemed out of place. No one anticipated that this session would be remembered years later. No one anticipated that the room would erupt with shock and disbelief before the end of the morning. Outside the room, pedestrians went about their day unaware. Television cameras prepared their feeds as if the day would pass uneventfully. Social media users would see headlines later, but at this moment, nothing seemed unusual. Inside, the nominee waited patiently, confident in the rehearsed rhythm of the hearing. Every answer delivered would be measured, precise, and strategically safe. Confidence radiated in small ways. The slight nod to the chairman, the smooth adjustment of a sleeve, the controlled eye contact with committee members. But the calm in the room was deceptive. There was a quiet tension, imperceptible to the casual observer, growing beneath the surface. A storm was approaching, not visible in the usual channels, not audible in conversations, but inevitable. In one corner of the room, a lawmaker prepared in silence. No fanfare, no overt gestures, just methodical preparation, stacks of carefully organized documents, and hours of study and research that the rest of the room could not see. The energy in this presence was different, focused, precise, determined. While the room believed it controlled the moment, the lawmaker carried an unseen weight of evidence and verification, a preparation that would soon shift the balance entirely. The cameras rolled as if nothing was about to happen. The microphones captured a room that appeared ordinary. Reporters typed with casual attention, expecting routine statements. Senators leaned back in their seats, thinking the hearing would follow the normal script. But that expectation, the comfort of predictability, would soon make the surprise all the more powerful. For now, the committee room remained calm. Notes were flipped. Pages shuffled. Chairs creaked under the subtle movement of restless professionals. The air smelled faintly of paper, polished wood, and a hint of coffee. The hum of ventilation was almost meditative. It was the kind of quiet that encourages overconfidence. And in that calm, the nominee's assurance appeared absolute. Every nod, every word, every subtle smile communicated control. The room's rhythm was steady, predictable, and convincing. There was no reason for anyone to expect anything disruptive. But history has a way of entering quietly. It rarely arrives with a warning. Often, it waits until confidence becomes complacency. And when the lawmaker in that corner finally spoke, it wouldn't matter that the cameras had been rolling for hours. The routine would shatter. The calm would vanish. Because all it would take was one question. One carefully crafted, meticulously prepared, undeniable question. And in that moment, the world that believed it was ordinary would be forever changed. For now, the nominee sat at the center of a room that seemed routine. A space framed by marble columns, microphones, and polished wood. The senators leaned back, confident in their preparation. The reporters typed quietly, expecting nothing unusual. The cameras recorded calmly, framing the scene as ordinary government procedure. But beneath that surface, the weight of preparation, the anticipation of scrutiny, and the hidden evidence were waiting for their cue. And when that cue arrived, the calm would vanish instantly, replaced by tension, surprise, and the slow, inevitable unfolding of accountability in real time. History rarely announces itself with fanfare. It often begins quietly, in routine spaces, under ordinary conditions, unnoticed by all but those who are ready. And this morning in Washington was one such moment. One question. One folder. One person who refused to accept appearances at face value. That was all it would take. And at that moment, though the room remained calm, the first ripple of change had already begun. The cameras rolled. The microphones transmitted sound. The routine continued. The world outside remained unaware. But in the quiet, the stage had been set. The calm before the storm was complete. And soon everything would change. The nominee sat at the center of the committee room, an image of composure and authority. Every gesture, every expression, had been calculated for months. Every word had been rehearsed. Every question anticipated. This was no longer just a hearing. It was a performance, a meticulously choreographed display of poise designed to reassure, impress, and withstand scrutiny. Observers from outside the room would have seen nothing unusual. A calm, professional figure at the center of a large polished table, flanked by attentive aides. Microphones poised. Cameras rolling. Reporters typing with routine focus. The senator's gaze measured, polite, almost bored. Everything seemed ordinary. And for a brief moment, it was. The previous 2 days of questioning had gone smoothly. The nominee's record had been praised. Every tough question about ethics, political alliances, or prior decisions had been met with the same confident, controlled tone. There were nods of approval from Republican colleagues. Even some Democrats had commented on the meticulous preparation, the years of experience, the carefully cultivated credibility. This was power in motion. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It didn't need to be. Confidence like this doesn't shout. It sits quietly, steady, and it convinces people that the outcome is inevitable. Inside the room, small details reinforced the aura of control. The nominee's hands rested lightly on the polished surface of the desk, fingers interlaced, nails immaculate, posture unshakable. Eyes flicked briefly to the chairman, acknowledging the procedural formalities without unnecessary motion. A gentle, confident smile passed over the face when an assistant leaned in with a note. Nothing betrayed worry, hesitation, or uncertainty. Every movement was deliberate. The room itself seemed to acknowledge it. The hum of the ventilation system, the faint click of cameras, the distant echo of footsteps outside. Everything contributed to a sense of normalcy, an expectation that the hearing would continue as it always had. And that was the moment when subtle tension began to creep in. In one corner of the room, away from the cameras, a lawmaker prepared differently. No rehearsed lines. No kerfel smiles. No reliance on past praise or routine. Instead, there was evidence. Documentation meticulously gathered over weeks. Hours spent tracing connections, patterns, and discrepancies invisible to casual observation. Charts, spreadsheets, financial records, emails, carefully organized and stacked in neat piles, folders labeled and color-coded, ready to be referenced at exactly the right moment. The contrast was almost cinematic. On one side, polished power, rehearsed and confident. On the other, meticulous preparation, silent and unseen. No one in the room yet knew which side would define the day. As the chairman called the next session to order, the nominee responded with calm nods and courteous acknowledgement. Words would come. Answers would flow. The posture suggested mastery, control, and inevitability. Every seated senator assumed the same. This was routine. Nothing unusual could interrupt it. But the lawmaker's quiet intensity was building, like water behind a dam. No one noticed yet, but the dam was about to break. The first questions were standard. Policy positions. Past experience. Procedural inquiries. The nominee answered smoothly. Polished responses flowed effortlessly. Phrases carefully chosen for maximum reassurance. No hesitación. No eres. A few subtle smiles. Occasional eye contact with supportive colleagues. Every reaction measured. This performance reinforced the perception that nothing could go wrong. Confidence like this has a way of intoxicating a room. It lulls observers into the belief that everything is under control, that the outcome is predetermined. But beneath the surface, patterns had already been traced. Lines of money, connections between corporate entities, dates and times aligned in sequences too deliberate to be coincidental. The lawmaker had spent sleepless nights cross-referencing documents, ensuring that when the moment came, there would be no doubt, no ambiguity, no room for excuses. The first subtle signal appeared when the lawmaker quietly adjusted a folder, aligning pages just so. A moment invisible to most, but a signal that preparation was ready. The posture was calm, almost casual, but it carried the weight of inevitability. The nominee continued speaking, answering the next round of questions with the same steady cadence. Each answer reinforced confidence. Each gesture suggested nothing in the room could challenge this control. But the cameras, the microphones, the reporters, they were capturing only the surface. They couldn't yet see the hidden tension building like a storm gathering behind still clouds. Observers from outside might have described the nominee as untouchable. Someone who had mastered the stage. Someone who had rehearsed history itself. And in many ways that was true. For now. But confidence alone cannot withstand facts. Preparation alone can. And preparation was quietly assembling. Every page of the folder, every highlighted line, every time-stamped document had been carefully placed. No detail too small, no connection overlooked. This was methodical, relentless, and precise. And the lawmaker knew the value of timing. One question, asked at the exact right moment, could shatter the veneer of power completely. Meanwhile, the nominee's polished confidence continued. Calm. Steady. Smiles at reporters. Small nods to colleagues. The posture of someone who believes the outcome is certain. Even the smallest hint of doubt, hesitation, or surprise would have undermined the carefully constructed performance. The lawmaker's approach was different. No esmail. No performance. No assumptions. Only facts, documents, and evidence. Waiting. Patient. Calculating the moment to strike. As the next round of questions approached, the tension became imperceptibly thicker. Chairs creaked under subtle shifts. Pens hovered over paper, paused. A few senators glanced at one another, sensing something unfamiliar in the air. The difference between the two figures in the room could not have been more stark. On one side, rehearsed confidence, power, polish, and experience. On the other, silent preparation, undeniable evidence, relentless focus. And the cameras captured neither. The microphones recorded only the routine exchange of procedural questions. The world outside remained unaware. But the foundation had shifted. The calm that had dominated segment 1 was beginning to crack. The lawmaker's folder remained closed, hands poised but steady. The next question was being formulated silently, mentally rehearsed over and over. Timing, phrasing, sequence, all had been perfected. The delivery would be precise, irrefutable. Meanwhile, the nominee continued in the illusion of control. Answers flowed. Smiles remained polite. Hands rested confidently on the table. Eyes flicked casually across the room. Nothing suggested vulnerability, hesitation, or surprise. Everything suggested mastery. But power, no matter how polished, is only as strong as the evidence it can withstand. And evidence, carefully prepared and precisely delivered, does not yield to confidence alone. Soon the room would feel it. A shift. A subtle tension. A moment where control would slip. A question would arrive. And everything the nominee thought was secure would begin to unravel. For now the calm persisted. The performance continued. Observers outside the room remained unaware. Cameras rolled. Reporters typed. Senators leaned back, expecting another routine session. But underneath that composed exterior, history had already begun to stir. Because it doesn't matter how confident someone is, how rehearsed their answers, how polished their appearance. When preparation meets truth, confidence alone cannot prevail. And that moment, though invisible now, was coming. The room had settled into the rhythm of a routine hearing. Voices were calm, pens scratched lightly across notepads. Cameras clicked at predictable intervals. The polished performance of the nominee remained unshakable, or so it appeared. Confidence radiated from every gesture. The tilt of the head, the careful articulation of words, the subtle but steady cadence of a voice trained over years to reassure and persuade. But beneath this veneer of control, a different force was gathering. The lawmaker, who until now had been quietly seated, exuding calm focus, slowly reached for the folder that contained weeks of painstaking research. The heavy manila folder was unassuming from a distance, but inside it lay the fruits of tireless labor. Corporate filings, bank statements, meticulously annotated spreadsheets, emails, and correspondence tracing connections invisible to the casual observer. The first page slid smoothly across the polished surface of the desk. The moment seemed almost ceremonial. Every senator in the room straightened instinctively. Reporters glanced up, sensing a subtle change in atmosphere. The air itself seemed to thicken. Something unseen was about to disrupt the carefully maintained order. The lawmaker cleared her throat, her tone calm, almost conversational, but carrying a weight that drew immediate attention. "Miss Bondi," she began, voice steady, "I'd like to discuss your family's business interests." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. They were simple, precise, and deliberate. Yet in that simplicity was a quiet potency. For the first time in the hearing, the nominee's eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly, toward the folder. A tiny hesitation, just enough to register to those trained to notice. And to the audience watching from afar, still invisible, the nominee's posture remained upright, hands clasped, smile carefully intact. "Congresswoman, all of my financial interests have been disclosed as required by law," she replied, maintaining an air of composed authority. But the lawmaker didn't relent. She reached back into the folder, pulling out a second page, highlighted and annotated, every detail cross-checked. Her voice did not rise. It did not waver. "I am not referring to your personal investments," she clarified, placing the document deliberately on the desk. "I am referring to Bondi Family Enterprises, a Delaware corporation formed in 2019. The room shifted imperceptibly. Senators straightened in their chairs, their attention drawn in a unified wave toward the unfolding scene. Reporters paused mid-typing. A low hum of anticipation threaded through the gallery. Even the room's ventilation system seemed suddenly conspicuous, the soft mechanical whispering echoing louder than usual. The nominee's face remained composed, but just barely. The first real crack appeared as her lips parted slightly, hesitation flickering across features trained to remain flawless. Her attorneys leaned in, whispering urgently. But the lawmaker's eyes never left her target. Every movement had been calculated. Every second measured. This was not a performance, it was a surgical strike. The lawmaker continued, unfurling details with relentless precision. Corporate registration records, the names of family members listed as incorporators, addresses, and related entities across multiple states. Nevada, Wyoming, South Dakota. Each name and address carefully highlighted. Each connection traced through layers of trusts and legal structures. Each revelation, delivered in calm, measured tones, eroded the controlled exterior of the nominee. What had been confidence now began to fracture under the weight of meticulously documented evidence. A subtle tightening around the jaw, a barely perceptible shift in posture, a hand reaching instinctively toward a water glass. All micro-expressions that suggested unease, however fleeting. The lawmaker paused, allowing each revelation to sink in. She didn't shout. She didn't dramatize. She simply let the documents speak for themselves, allowing the weight of evidence to do the work. It was a masterclass in controlled confrontation, a demonstration of how preparation and evidence could dismantle even the most polished performance. "Does this entity ring a bell now?" she asked, voice steady. The question hung in the air like a precise blade. Silence filled the room. The gallery seemed to hold its breath. The nominee exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly. I'd have to review the document," she admitted, voice carefully measured, attempting to retain control. The lawmaker nodded as if expecting that response, and without missing a beat, placed another set of pages on the desk. 7 related entities, she explained, each registered across multiple states, each connected to the family network. Financial flows traced meticulously. Some remained domestic. Others had quietly shifted offshore. Low-interest loans issued to family members. Consulting contracts with international firms. The tension escalated with every sentence, every slide of paper. What had begun as a routine hearing now felt like a courtroom drama. The gallery, once a passive observer of procedural norms, now leaned forward in collective attention. Reporters adjusted cameras, pens paused mid-sentence, staffers glanced at one another, sensing an unprecedented disruption of expectations. The nominee's smile faltered, almost imperceptibly. Confidence wavered at the edges. Her responses, once polished and assured, now became shorter, carefully measured, defensive. Each new document laid bare details that were impossible to dismiss or deflect. And yet the lawmaker remained calm. Her voice, steady and unhurried, carried the weight of preparation and fact, letting the evidence shape the narrative rather than dramatics or emotion. She methodically traced the flow of money, connecting dots across time, geography, and corporate structures. The gallery murmured quietly. Even seasoned senators, accustomed to political theater, recognized the extraordinary precision of the moment. The room's energy shifted from routine procedural engagement to acute tension, a palpable sense of anticipation as the first clear signs of a breakdown began to emerge. The nominee's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water. A subtle gesture, invisible to the untrained eye but immediately readable to observers familiar with human behavior under stress. The camera caught it. The microphone transmitted the soft clink of glass. Small cracks were appearing in a carefully maintained exterior. As the segment drew toward its close, the lawmaker prepared to escalate the questioning further. The room was now fully attuned to the unfolding drama. The calm of the initial hearing had evaporated. Routine had transformed into revelation. Control, once absolute on one side, had begun to slip under the quiet, relentless precision of truth. This was the first strike, the initial crack, the beginning of a sequence that would escalate into full exposure, undeniable accountability, and a moment of history captured live in real time. And it all started with a single folder, a calm voice, and a question backed by evidence. The kind of question no one else had the preparation, patience, or courage to ask. "Does this entity ring a bell now?" she asked, voice steady. The question hung in the air like a precise blade. Silence filled the room. The gallery seemed to hold its breath. The nominee exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly. I'd have to review the document," she admitted, voice carefully measured, attempting to retain control. The lawmaker nodded as if expecting that response, and without missing a beat, placed another set of pages on the desk. 7 related entities, she explained, each registered across multiple states, each connected to the family network. Financial flows traced meticulously. Some remained domestic. Others had quietly shifted offshore. Low-interest loans issued to family members. Consulting contracts with international firms. The tension escalated with every sentence, every slide of paper. What had begun as a routine hearing now felt like a courtroom drama. The gallery, once a passive observer of procedural norms, now leaned forward in collective attention. Reporters adjusted cameras, pens paused mid-sentence, staffers glanced at one another, sensing an unprecedented disruption of expectations. The nominee's smile faltered, almost imperceptibly. Confidence wavered at the edges. Her responses, once polished and assured, now became shorter, carefully measured, defensive. Each new document laid bare details that were impossible to dismiss or deflect. And yet the lawmaker remained calm. Her voice, steady and unhurried, carried the weight of preparation and fact, letting the evidence shape the narrative rather than dramatics or emotion. She methodically traced the flow of money, connecting dots across time, geography, and corporate structures. The gallery murmured quietly. Even seasoned senators, accustomed to political theater, recognized the extraordinary precision of the moment. The room's energy shifted from routine procedural engagement to acute tension, a palpable sense of anticipation as the first clear signs of a breakdown began to emerge. The nominee's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water. A subtle gesture, invisible to the untrained eye but immediately readable to observers familiar with human behavior under stress. The camera caught it. The microphone transmitted the soft clink of glass. Small cracks were appearing in a carefully maintained exterior. As the segment drew toward its close, the lawmaker prepared to escalate the questioning further. The room was now fully attuned to the unfolding drama. The calm of the initial hearing had evaporated. Routine had transformed into revelation. Control, once absolute on one side, had begun to slip under the quiet, relentless precision of truth. This was the first strike, the initial crack, the beginning of a sequence that would escalate into full exposure, undeniable accountability, and a moment of history captured live in real time. And it all started with a single folder, a calm voice, and a question backed by evidence. The kind of question no one else had the preparation, patience, or courage to ask. The air in the hearing room had changed completely. What had started as a routine confirmation was no longer just a procedure. It had become a performance of accountability, and every eye in the room felt the tension. The lawmaker, calm and collected, continued to unfold layer after layer of meticulously gathered evidence. Each page, each spreadsheet, each email built a narrative that was impossible to ignore. The nominee, once confident and composed, now sat rigidly, fingers tapping lightly on the desk, a faint sheen of sweat visible under the bright hearing room lights. Her smile, carefully rehearsed for public television, had thinned into something tentative. The cameras didn't miss a beat. Every microexpression was captured, magnified, and transmitted live across networks. "Miss Bondi," the lawmaker said, her voice steady but authoritative, "these documents show payments from international entities to Bondi family enterprises. Can you explain the purpose of these transactions?" The question hung in the air. The room was silent, save for the quiet hum of recording equipment and the low murmur of scribbling pens. The nominee swallowed and tried to respond, but her usual confidence faltered. These are standard consulting arrangements," she said, her voice tighter than before. "All required disclosures have been made, as per the law." But the lawmaker didn't back down. She placed another document on the desk, a clear chain of financial activity linking multiple entities across states and offshore accounts. "These payments," she said, her tone calm, "moved in ways that obscure ownership and control. Some funds were sent abroad, others returned as low-interest loans. Can you clarify the intent?" At that moment, the gallery seemed to hold its collective breath. Staffers glanced at one another. Senators leaned forward, scanning the pages with heightened interest. Even seasoned political reporters, accustomed to procedural hearings, could feel the unusual gravity of the moment. The nominee's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. The subtle gesture, caught on camera, was the first unmistakable sign that the pressure was beginning to crack her composure. She exhaled sharply and tried to regain control. "These are routine structures used in family-owned businesses," she said a little too quickly, hoping to assert authority. But the lawmaker was relentless. She picked up another sheet, this one highlighting consulting contracts with foreign-linked firms. "These arrangements," she explained, "coincide with discussions about U.S. Department of Justice policy. Can you explain if any guidance was provided to these entities?" The words hit hard. The room went quiet. The tension escalated from discomfort to palpable anxiety. Every movement, every glance, every hesitation was amplified under the scrutiny of live cameras. The nominee's composure wavered further, a flash of panic crossing her face before she managed to regain a semblance of poise. It was clear to everyone in the room. This hearing was no longer routine. The lawmaker's methodical approach had transformed a procedural session into a high-stakes confrontation. The exposure was mounting, the pressure intensifying, and the narrative unfolding with undeniable clarity. The first strike had landed. Now the escalation was in full motion. By now, the calm and controlled atmosphere of the Senate hearing had evaporated entirely. What had begun as a procedural confirmation was now a high-stakes confrontation. The lawmaker, composed and deliberate, continued presenting evidence with surgical precision, each document exposing more layers of previously unseen financial and corporate activity. The audience could sense that the nominee was beginning to unravel under the weight of scrutiny. The nominee's confident posture, once upright and commanding, now showed subtle signs of distress. Hands fidgeted. Her breathing became slightly uneven, and the eyes that had radiated assurance now flickered nervously across the room. Every pause, every hesitation, every forced smile betrayed the growing pressure. Cameras, capturing every micro-expression, broadcasted these cracks to viewers across the nation. "Miss Bondi," the lawmaker said, her voice steady yet firm, "these records indicate repeated international transactions tied to entities registered under multiple family members. Can you clarify your family's role in facilitating these transfers?" The room went silent. Even the stenographers seemed to sense the tension. The nominee swallowed hard, trying to maintain a measured response. "These transactions were all disclosed according to legal requirements," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "No laws were violated and all procedures were followed." But the lawmaker did not relent. She slid another document across the table, a chronological timeline showing payments flowing through multiple domestic subsidiaries, and then into offshore accounts. The timing of these transactions aligns suspiciously with discussions about Department of Justice policies, she explained. "Would you say these were coincidental?" A faint murmur rippled through the gallery. Senators shifted in their seats, leaning forward to examine the evidence. Reporters clicked keyboards rapidly, sending live updates. Even the staffers behind the scenes exchanged concerned glances. The quiet composure of a typical hearing had been replaced by a charged, almost cinematic tension. The nominee reached again for her water glass, fingers trembling this time. The camera zoomed in on the small, involuntary movements. A bead of sweat rolling down her temple, a shallow intake of breath, the subtle shake of a hand. The public could now see vulnerability in real time. A rare moment for someone who had projected control for days. The lawmaker continued methodically. "Let's review your family's consulting contracts. These agreements involved international firms seeking access to U.S. legal and regulatory processes. Were you or any family member involved in providing strategic insight to these organizations while your nomination was under consideration?" The words landed like a punch. The room fell into near silence. Every eye was fixed on the nominee, who now struggled to maintain composure. Her lips parted, then closed tightly. Her response, when it came, was clipped and defensive. "I categorically deny any wrongdoing. These contracts were handled independently of my nomination process." Even as she spoke, the lawmaker produced yet another folder of documents, detailing communications, phone logs, and contractual agreements. Each page built on the previous revelation, forming an airtight narrative that left little room for evasion. The audience could feel the tension rising. What had been procedural was now explosive. The nominee's composure was at its breaking point. The subtle signs, shaking hands, uneven breathing, darting eyes, were now impossible to ignore. Every subtle gesture broadcast a growing sense of panic. The lawmaker's calm, methodical presentation had turned the entire hearing into a spectacle of accountability. The tension in the hearing room had now reached a boiling point. Every subtle sign of discomfort from the nominee, trembling hands, shallow breaths, and darting eyes, was magnified under the intense scrutiny of live cameras. What had begun as a calm procedural hearing was now an unfolding political spectacle. Senators leaned forward in disbelief, staffers whispered nervously, and reporters typed feverishly, capturing every reaction in real time. The lawmaker's approach remained methodical, deliberate, and unwavering. Each document she produced added weight to the already overwhelming evidence, connecting the nominee's family to offshore accounts, international consulting contracts, and low-interest loans that had previously flown under the radar. It wasn't speculation, it was traceable, verifiable, and damning. The nominee could feel the room closing in. Every prepared talking point she had rehearsed over weeks seemed inadequate against the cold, methodical presentation of facts. She adjusted in her seat, glanced nervously toward her attorneys, and attempted to regain her composure. "These are private family matters," she said sharply, her voice betraying tension she had worked so hard to hide. The lawmaker didn't flinch. "Private or not," she responded evenly, "these matters intersect with your pending confirmation and potential influence over U.S. legal and regulatory decisions. The public has a right to clarity." A subtle murmur ran through the gallery. Even veteran senators, accustomed to routine hearings, recognized that this confrontation was unlike anything they had witnessed. Every page of evidence, every clearly documented financial trail, reinforced the narrative that this was no ordinary confirmation. Suddenly, the nominee leaned forward, voice rising, tone defensive. "This is an outrageous attack on my family. You're twisting routine business arrangements into something they are not." Her outburst shattered the carefully controlled environment. Phones flashed, cameras zoomed, and live broadcasts captured the moment for millions watching across the country. The gallery reacted immediately. Some gasped audibly, others whispered among themselves, while reporters scrambled to update live feeds. The lawmaker, however, remained composed, her voice calm and unwavering. "We are not twisting anything," she said firmly. "We are presenting evidence. And evidence is what informs accountability." The nominee, realizing that her defenses were faltering under the relentless scrutiny, reached for another folder of papers, flipping through them with increasing urgency. The shaking in her hands betrayed the growing panic, visible even on high-definition cameras. The room had transformed from a procedural setting into a live courtroom drama. Outside the hearing room, social media exploded. Clips of the nominee's defensive outbursts circulated within minutes. Hashtags began trending nationwide. Analysts and commentators debated the implications, dissecting every expression, every word, every gesture. The story was no longer confined to Capitol Hill. It had entered the public consciousness as a symbol of accountability, preparation, and the power of meticulous evidence. Inside the room, the lawmaker allowed a moment of silence after the outburst. Each senator, staffer, and reporter could feel the weight of what was happening. A routine hearing had become a historical moment of political exposure. The nominee's defensive reaction only amplified the significance of the revelations, reinforcing the impression that the evidence was both undeniable and deeply consequential. The hearing room had shifted into a different reality. The calm, procedural rhythm of the Senate session was gone, replaced by a tense, almost theatrical showdown. The nominee's defensive outburst had set the tone. There was no going back to routine. The lawmaker, unshaken by the sudden anger, continued to present evidence with methodical precision, each document reinforcing the narrative of concealed financial activity and international entanglements. The nominee, visibly rattled, leaned toward her legal counsel, whispering urgently. Her once confident demeanor was now replaced by desperation. "I need to invoke my rights," she said, voice low but firm, signaling a shift from verbal defenses to formal legal protections. Her attorneys nodded quickly, aware that the public spectacle was now about to intersect with constitutional strategy. Mr. Chairman, one attorney began, standing slightly from his seat, we object to further questioning. On the advice of counsel, my client invokes her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Senators froze mid-note, staffers exchanged stunned glances, and the gallery fell into a tense hush. Cameras immediately zoomed in on the nominee, her eyes wide and hand gripping the edge of the table. For viewers at home, the moment was electrifying. A historic invocation of constitutional rights during a live confirmation hearing. The lawmaker remained calm, though her eyes reflected the gravity of the situation. Understood, she said deliberately. Miss Bondi, do you intend to refuse further questioning regarding your family's business dealings? The nominee hesitated, then quietly, almost defeated, said, yes. The word, simple yet monumental, reverberated through the room. Reporters scrambled to capture every reaction. Senators whispered among themselves, debating implications. The session, already tense, had now crossed into unprecedented territory. Phones lit up across the Capitol. Journalists outside the room immediately began live updates. Headlines flashed, streaming alerts announced the invocation of the Fifth Amendment, and social media erupted. Within minutes, clips of the hearing went viral. Hashtags relating to the nominee, the lawmaker, and the unfolding scandal began trending nationwide. The country was witnessing accountability in real time, and the magnitude of the event was not lost on anyone. Inside the room, chaos was tempered only by procedural decorum. Republican senators murmured objections, but the chairman maintained order, striking gavels with measured authority. The lawmaker, meanwhile, continued her work, stacking evidence, clarifying points, and keeping the session focused on the documented trail rather than emotional reactions. Each document placed on the table told a story that the nominee could no longer verbally control. The gallery's whispers grew louder as the narrative unfolded. Offshore accounts, consulting contracts with foreign-linked firms, financial flows traced across multiple states, all leading to the undeniable conclusion that the nominee's family business activities intersected dangerously with potential public office responsibilities. Every moment the nominee remained silent under her Fifth Amendment claim only amplified the tension. The room felt like it was on the edge of collapse. What had started as a routine hearing had now become a defining moment in political accountability. Every gesture, every document, every pause was a statement. For the nominee, the invocation of legal protections was a defensive necessity. For the lawmaker, it was a testament to preparation, persistence, and the power of evidence. The Senate hearing had officially crossed the threshold from routine procedure to historic spectacle. With the nominee invoking her Fifth Amendment rights, the session had become a lightning rod for national attention. The gallery was buzzing with whispers, cameras focused intently on each movement, and senators exchanged hurried notes and side conversations. What had been expected as a standard confirmation had now spiraled into chaos. Immediately, aides and staffers began scrambling to manage the fallout. Phones rang incessantly as members of Congress, legal advisors, and communications teams tried to understand the implications. Live news feeds cut into regular programming, and breaking news alerts flashed across televisions nationwide. The nominee's name trended on social media within minutes, with hashtags highlighting both her family's financial dealings and the unprecedented invocation of constitutional rights during a confirmation hearing. Political commentators and analysts dissected every moment. Clips of the nominee's defensive outburst and subsequent silence circulated across news platforms, showing her once confident composure now replaced with visible unease. Pundits debated the legal ramifications, while journalists highlighted the methodical presentation of evidence by the lawmaker, emphasizing that this was not political theater, but carefully documented investigation. Meanwhile, the senators themselves faced immediate pressure. Republican colleagues whispered to each other, expressing frustration and concern about the optics. Democratic members leaned forward, scrutinizing the details, recognizing that they were witnessing a historic moment of accountability. The chairman, trying to maintain order, banged the gavel repeatedly, but even procedural authority could not mask the tension filling the chamber. The nominee's legal team huddled quietly at the side of the room, reviewing notes, phone logs, and financial records in a desperate attempt to anticipate next steps. Every movement was being recorded, analyzed, and broadcasted, leaving little room for error. The public could witness in real time the unraveling of a carefully constructed facade. Social media amplified the effect exponentially. Within minutes, commentators, influencers, and political insiders had shared snippets, highlighting every facial expression, gesture, and document presented. Public reactions ranged from shock to outrage, with many expressing disbelief that someone with such high-level political ambitions would face such scrutiny and potential exposure. Memes, timelines, and analytical threads appeared instantly, dissecting the unfolding drama for millions of viewers. Inside the hearing room, tension reached a fever pitch as the lawmaker continued to present evidence, carefully pacing each revelation to maintain clarity and impact. Offshore accounts, international consulting contracts, and low-interest loans were laid bare for senators, staffers, and reporters alike. Every revelation deepened the implications, suggesting that the nominee's family dealings were not only complex, but potentially intersected with sensitive U.S. government functions. By the time the session reached its midpoint, it was clear that this hearing would not conclude conventionally. The public, media, and political figures alike recognized that history was unfolding in real time. The nominee, though silent under legal protection, remained at the center of a storm she could no longer control. Every camera angle, every flash of light, every whispered reaction contributed to a spectacle that would be remembered as a defining moment in political oversight. The morning after the hearing, Washington was buzzing like never before. News outlets ran continuous coverage, repeating clips from the previous day. The nominee's defensive outburst, the tense silence following the Fifth Amendment invocation, and the lawmaker calmly presenting detailed evidence. Headlines screamed about accountability, offshore accounts, and potential conflicts of interest. The hearing was no longer confined to Capitol Hill. It had taken on national significance. Within hours, federal investigators moved quickly. Offices linked to the nominee's family enterprises were sealed, computers and hard drives confiscated, and financial records were meticulously cataloged. Law enforcement personnel acted with precision, understanding the sensitivity of the case and the public attention it had drawn. The scope of the investigation was immense, targeting multiple entities, financial transactions, and communications connected to international consulting contracts. Political shockwaves followed immediately. Several senators, previously supportive of the nominee, began quietly withdrawing their endorsements. The nomination, once considered a near certainty, now teetered on the brink. Staffers whispered in hallways, party leaders held emergency meetings, and political analysts debated the long-term consequences for both parties. It was clear that a single folder and one line of questioning had shifted the balance of power. Meanwhile, the nominee's legal team scrambled to respond. Press statements attempted to frame the situation as political overreach and media sensationalism, but the carefully documented evidence made it difficult to counter. Financial flows traced across states, offshore accounts, and international contracts provided a clear and undeniable trail. Every attempt at mitigation seemed to collapse under the weight of fact-based scrutiny. Back in Congress, lawmakers introduced emergency measures to increase transparency and prevent similar conflicts in future nominations. Ethics committees convened special sessions, and oversight hearings were scheduled to review disclosure processes. The events of the hearing were now influencing legislative priorities, demonstrating how a single meticulously prepared confrontation could ripple through the system. Social media, too, amplified the consequences. Clips from the hearing were dissected in detail, threaded into analysis of international contracts and legal loopholes. Influencers and political commentators debated the nominee's strategy, the lawmaker's preparation, and the broader implications for government accountability. Public engagement reached levels rarely seen for a confirmation hearing, as millions debated, shared, and questioned the ethics of those seeking high office. The nominee herself remained largely silent. Confined by her Fifth Amendment protection, she could neither defend nor clarify her position publicly. Every statement from her attorneys was carefully worded, attempting to balance legal strategy with public perception. Meanwhile, the lawmaker quietly returned to her office, preparing for the next phase. follow-up investigations, additional documentation requests, and ensuring that every lead was fully explored. This phase of the saga demonstrated a profound shift in political accountability. Where once hearings had been procedural formalities, now preparation, documentation, and evidence became central. Lawmakers, journalists, and the public alike were reminded that thorough oversight could override influence, status, and even long-held political assumptions. The combination of legal scrutiny, media attention, and legislative reaction created a feedback loop that would define the remainder of the nominee's career and reshape how future confirmations were conducted. The events of the hearing had set a precedent. No matter the office, no matter the power, accountability could reach even the most shielded figures. The following weeks were a whirlwind of unprecedented political and legal activity. Federal investigators, now fully mobilized, dug deep into the financial and corporate structures connected to the nominee's family. Every transaction, every offshore account, every consulting contract was meticulously traced. Teams of forensic accountants, legal experts, and investigators worked tirelessly, connecting threads across states, international jurisdictions, and corporate entities. The depth and scale of the operation revealed something far larger than initially imagined. A network of influence, access, and financial maneuvering that had operated under the radar for years. Meanwhile, the nominee's political support crumbled rapidly. Senators who had once praised her experience quietly retracted endorsements, citing concern over unresolved financial entanglements and questions of integrity. Party leaders, fearing public backlash and damage to their reputations, publicly expressed reservations about the confirmation. The nomination, which had once seemed inevitable, collapsed entirely. Within days, a formal withdrawal of candidacy was announced, accompanied by carefully worded statements from both the nominee and her legal team, attempting to mitigate public perception while acknowledging the legal reality. The legal ramifications extended beyond the political sphere. Prosecutors moved swiftly, filing charges against multiple members of the nominee's family, including her siblings and business partners. Allegations ranged from money laundering, tax evasion, and failure to disclose conflicts of interest, to more serious accusations involving foreign influence and consulting for international entities with ties to government operations abroad. Court proceedings were complex and highly publicized, with each session revealing additional details from the exhaustive investigation. Evidence presented in court was staggering. Financial documents, emails, phone records, and contracts painted a picture of a sophisticated system designed to obscure ownership, funnel money internationally, and create plausible deniability while maintaining control over vast financial resources. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and British Virgin Islands were traced to shell corporations, low-interest loans, and strategic transfers that mirrored patterns commonly associated with influence operations. The courtrooms became a stage for the public to witness the collapse of a carefully constructed empire. The nominee herself faced intense scrutiny. Her invocation of the Fifth Amendment during the hearing had temporarily shielded her, but as the investigation progressed, it became clear that legal protections could not prevent accountability. Testimonies from former employees, accountants, and corporate officers unveiled the operational mechanisms behind the family enterprise. Recordings of phone calls and emails demonstrated coordinated efforts to use the nominee's position, or potential position, for private financial gain. The public, media, and legal observers followed every revelation with rapt attention. As the trials unfolded, verdicts were delivered with unprecedented speed and clarity. Multiple family members were convicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and failure to report conflicts of interest. The nominee herself faced charges directly tied to her alleged use of public office for private benefit, including attempts to obscure financial ties and influence government decisions. Court proceedings were meticulous, with prosecutors presenting chronological evidence linking documents, communications, and transactions to actionable offenses. The courtroom was silent during the most damning moments, as jurors, legal observers, and the public grappled with the scale of misconduct. Beyond individual consequences, the case reshaped Washington's political landscape. Congress passed sweeping reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability for nominees and public officials. Ethics disclosure requirements were expanded to include immediate family members, offshore holdings, and previously opaque corporate structures. Committees hired forensic accountants routinely, and oversight hearings became far more thorough, emphasizing the importance of documentation and preparation. Lobbyists and consulting firms faced stricter regulations, as foreign-linked financial arrangements were scrutinized more intensely than ever before. The lawmaker who had initiated the investigation emerged as a symbol of preparation, diligence, and accountability. Her methodical approach, reliance on verifiable evidence, and refusal to be distracted by political theater became a case study in effective oversight. Students in law schools, ethics courses, and public administration programs analyzed the hearing as a masterclass in preparation, strategy, and the power of meticulous documentation. Her reputation grew quietly,